Hello everyone, Thomas from Medieval Review here, and more news stories. This time we're actually going to go back and we're going to revisit one of the stories I covered actually in the first in this series of news stories. By the way, I think I've gotten great responses, so I'm going to continue doing these as long as I find interesting articles. So if you have articles you'd like to send my way, by all means, please do. I'll try to take a look at them. Can't promise I always get to every single one of them, but I actually really enjoy sitting down, reading the articles, and doing commentary. Also, just a general note, for videos such as this, because I don't do a lot of post-processing and editing on it, please always make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out Patreon if you'd like to support my efforts on this channel. Alright, let's talk about this news story. So this is published in the Museum of Cultural History, khm.uio.no, Norway, I believe. There we go, Norwegian right there on the screen. And this is that Viking era sword that was found high up in the mountains, kind of wedged in between some rocks. And this is the follow-up. They've done research on it, and they've done a lot of very interesting fact-finding. So we're going to dive right into this article and talk through it. So, a Viking sword from Lesja. And I'm assuming I'm saying that right, but I also don't speak the language, so I apologize if I'm not. Far into the mountains of Oppland in Norway, a sword from the Viking Age was stumbled upon by reindeer hunters during the fall of 2017. This sword has now arrived for conservation at the Museum of Cultural History. There's a nice picture of the sword there. It says an exceptionally well-preserved sword has been found in the mountains ridge of Kjollen in Lesja, Oppland. Its length is 92.8 centimeters and the weight of 1,203 grams, 1,203. And they have pictures in the gallery. I should be talking about the gallery in a bit here because it's got some really interesting stuff in it. It says, elevated and exposed. This sword was found high in the mountains at an altitude of 1,640 meters above sea level. That's actually pretty darn high. Probably the highest elevation a Viking sword has ever been found. Mountain graves from the Viking period are well known. In a grave, however, a sword will be accompanied by other grave goods. Because of this, the finders and archaeologists, as well as metal detectorists, went back into the mountains of Kjollen to see if there were additional objects at the site. However, no more objects were found, which could imply that this sword was lost by someone hiking through the mountains. It is even possible the owner perished there. Interesting stuff. Who knows, right? The sword was covered by snow during winter, but must have been exposed for periods also as spots of lichen had developed on the surface of the blade. The species seemed to be the map lichen. Here we go, you ready? Rhizocarpon geographicum. And by applying lycometry, which is dating the lichen by its growth, the spots seem to have formed within a few decades rather than hundreds of years. This is per Atle Nils. Again, not sure I'm saying that right. Department of Earth Sciences, the University of Bergen. Something is, however, a bit puzzling here. And this is where we're going to get to the interesting part of the article, how they're actually going to uncover the interesting bits. All it was a summation. We already knew that from the previous articles that we'd covered. Something is a bit puzzling here. At the scree where the sword was found, the snow would have melted for a short period each summer. So you got to think, right, talking about Norway, for those of you who are not as geographically inclined, because I know I'm not. I always have to look at a map to know where places are, but for where Norway is, we're talking about high latitude, lot less sunlight in winter, and in summer, you know, even then it's still really cold. So you're talking about a lot of standing snow a lot of times, especially at higher altitudes, potentially. I can't speak a lot to weather patterns and how it works out there, but needless to say, absolutely correct, right? There are periods of time where the snow would have melted, and this would have been buried under snow, but it also periodically would not have been. So, snow would have melted for a short period each summer, but if the sword was exposed for a few months every year for a millennium, why is it not covered by more lichen? Could the iron surface of the sword be less accommodating for lichen than the surrounding stones? Right? Who knows? I think this article was posted on the sword subreddit. I think actually someone posted some interesting information about how they deal with iron and rust specifically. Could the iron surface of the sword be less accommodating, like we said, than the surrounding stones? During the long winters, a sub-zero temperature would have kept all water frozen and thus inaccessible to corrosion processes. But what about the 1,000 summers? Right? And so, I mean, obviously you're talking about snow covers a thing. When snow melts, it's water. Water on iron or steel causes rust. That's going to happen over and over and over again. So why is this in such good condition? It's kind of mystery. So, albeit short summers, when the water would become liquefied and thus promote corrosion. Why is the iron not more deteriorated by corrosion? So they say, our best explanation for now is that the sword must have had optimal ventilation in its location between the large stones of the scree and was thus kept relatively dry. So here's, I guess, the concept. Got a lot of standing snow. As it melts, as it becomes water, that ventilation could essentially be good, nice, strong winds that take that and essentially evaporate it quickly enough to where it doesn't really stand as water, really, ever. And so it stays cool, dry, and well ventilated, right? There's hardly any salts promoting corrosion high in the mountains, and the sword had not been in contact with the soil. That's actually really important. Soil does two things really well. It helps preserve things and it helps corrode things, as weird as that sounds. It not being in contact with the soil is actually probably a lot to do with this staying in really good condition, because rocks don't really cause any additional problems, but soils can have all sorts of interesting things such as high pH or support forms of life that will help corrode things, etc., etc. Attributes related to the alloy of the iron could also be a contributing factor. So we know it's a type of iron, possibly a type of quasi-steel, and you know, no iron is completely pure iron, especially when you're talking about swords, original swords, and there could be things in it that help make it resistant to corrosion. This could actually be really interesting if they could do metallurgical analysis and tell us what that is. If we could find a naturally resistant to rust type metal that could be used for steel or something, that'd be pretty incredible. This says liking to be seen on the sword's blade. That's kind of like the little speckly spots, kind of greenish looking there. It might be hard to see in this video, but go check out the article. That'll link in the description below and you can see it. This attests to the sword being exposed to the elements. Despite this preservation, it's remarkable. Yeah, it is very remarkable. Alright, still sharp and functional. The sword was found with the tip poking up between large rocks in a scree. Exposed to the elements like this, the iron has seen some surface corrosion. That's really no surprise for such an old weapon, but the preservation is remarkable, which I think is an understatement, with the edge still remaining sharp. So we've got here a nice sharp edge. Take a moment when we go look at some of the pictures. It's so rare to see originals anywhere near this old that have the edges as sharp as they are, or at least as non-corroded, as non-falling apart. You look at a lot of old swords, you see it's very rough, and pits look like they've chipped away over time and corroded away over time. You're talking about a very thin part of the metal, and with that thinness comes not only that corrosion, but the effects of the corrosion to actually remove the material enough for it to fall apart. So it says it remains sharp. Fitted with new grip, the sword would still be functional today. That's pretty cool. X-rays seem to reveal a relatively simple blade construction. Some uneven wavy lines along with the blade may hint at a steel edge having been welded on. That's an important note because we know that things like that are done with like axes, let's say, or Japanese swords, where you put the metal that's going to be useful for the sharp edge on the edge and you don't really use it for the rest of the sword. So those wavy lines are basically what we're talking about as a Haman there, right? But it can also imply the merging of iron bars in the early stages of the forging process. So we're talking about forge welding at that point. So it could be kind of anything. The blade is not pattern welded, nor has it any iron inlays. And so it's not pattern welded, but it's like a quasi form potentially of that forge welding process. No iron inlays, so it's not, at the very least we know, it's not an Oppland. Hilt elements from disparate generations. Now, this is something that was hinted at by some really smart and observant people. I keyed in on it as well, but I mostly keyed off of what they were saying, so that's not my own expertise speaking. That there is actually a distinct difference between the pommel and the kind of cross piece that's on a Viking sword there. That they weren't necessarily conducive to the same time period. That is to say, they look like they aren't one and the same, or it's not the original version of the sword. Simple iron parts without any precious metal decoration make up the hilt of the sword. So I guess we call it kind of the poor man's sword. It's still probably a rich man's sword. It is a pragmatic sword, probably worn with pride, but not the highest strata of society. There we go. Such simple and unpretentious swords seem to be the norm in the mountain graves, and they are probably made, or at least hilted, in Norway. Aside from being exceptionally well preserved, the sword from Legia has an interesting trait. The hilt of the sword is actually composed of parts from two different types of hilts. So I spoke about this in the other news video. Viking era swords, you go look at like a Peterson typology or simplified Peterson typology or any Viking sword typology. They're almost always matched. You have very specific design traits that are paired together, and you could, in theory, take hundreds of sword hilt components from Viking era swords and jumble them together and then sit down and pick them back out because they match. It's like, you know, matching clothing or something, right? You can, certain patterns on cloth are going to be the same way. There's just certain ways it looks, certain ways they're built, the geometry of it, all that tends to be very similar. But again, it looks like it's two different pieces here, where one part might be 50 years younger than the other. So that's no surprise. You look at the lifespan of a sword, something's going to go wrong. It really makes you wonder, like, what would have happened to those specific pieces that they would have decided to replace it. Who knows? The guard, the part closest to the blade, is of Jan Peterson. I say Jan because I got a guy that I know whose name is Jan, but we call him Jan. A Jan Peterson Type C. So that was a... I'm trying to remember what I called it as. I don't remember. I think I said Type C, and then I said like Type M and Type one other type for the other bit. And I don't remember if I got that from Reddit or if I was just if I went and did my own looking at the Peterson typologies, but there you go. Type C, dated the years 800 to 850 AD. The pommel's a few generations younger. That means that it's the newer piece. And of a Jan Peterson Type M, dated to the years 850 to 950. This is actually pretty interesting. I would have actually reversed it in my head, that you'd probably replace the pommel piece before you replace the cross piece. Really makes you wonder what happened to the cross piece. Like, why did they need to replace that? Really don't know. The first impression was that the sword could perhaps have been an heirloom, but upon closer inspection through X-ray, the guard has cavities or recesses where the blade should have been fitted. The current blade, however, is far wider than the recesses, and the guard must originally have belonged to a much narrower blade, probably a slim, single-edged blade. This suggests that the guard itself is the oldest part of the sword from Legia. So maybe what happened here is they had an old sword that was broken, and the smith who was making this new sword just had pieces that he just picked up and said, I'm just going to use this to make this sword. Who knows? Really makes you wonder. This is the thing that I love about reading archaeological things, and I just got done talking about supposition, but this is the fun part of supposition, is look at a find and say, well, how did this come about? You make up any sort of wild theory, and within most contexts you could actually make sense of some really wild theories. This suggests the guard itself was the oldest part of the sword from Legia. We can only speculate what befell the owner of the sword and how it ended up where it was found. Like the people who rediscovered the sword, perhaps also the owner himself was a reindeer hunter who tragically got caught in a blizzard. He lost his sword, perhaps an heirloom, on a mountainside at Kjolland, and it would have taken 1,100 years to be rediscovered, still close to pristine condition. Taking a look at the gallery here as it loads. So, first off, I just want to speak to the beauty of that blade. There's a lot I could speak to, but I think the most interesting part to me is how the fuller moves into the somewhat spatulated tip of the blade. It actually kind of fades into it. You actually don't see this a lot in modern replicas. And that's mostly because of how they're made, and they're made very rough and maybe not always as accurate as they could be. And part of me wants to really know, is that kind of nice even transition intentional? Is it due to degradation of some of the steel we're just not really seeing? I don't know. Pretty interesting. You can see actually in this on the you may not even realize it's there, but the sword is pictured 3 times, one side, the other side, and then on edge. You can see on edge it's actually got a slight upturn in what is essentially the weak of the blade there. I'm gonna go through this way, just kind of one picture at a time. And sorry, some of these pictures are really large, so they load a little bit slow. And I don't completely think that's my internet's fault, but whatever. So here's that nice even transition I was talking about, how it just kind of fades into that tip. There's an element of beauty to that, in my opinion, and I really, really, really like it. I also find it very interesting how one side seems to have a little bit more of that corrosion effect, and the effect of lichens on it more so than the other. And I guess that could be sunlight or some aspect of having one side exposed versus the other to some aspect of the environment. Let's see here. Skip over that picture and that picture. Actually, the 2 things I really wanted to point out more than anything, I think, are, I'm just pulling up a couple of pictures here. So one is, here's the peen on it. Viking era swords go through a lot of different methods by which they make things. Sometimes swords were constructed exactly like this, and that was it. Sometimes they had more decorative aspects to them. It's actually a pretty rough looking peen, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, pretty interesting. One thing that I actually find really kind of frustrating is they talked about where the blade meets the cross piece, and there's no good picture of it. I would have liked to be able to see that. Anyway, here's the most interesting picture, because they give us all the measurements. Somebody go make this sword now, right? There's all your measurements right there. Can't say that I know how to read the language translation here for everything, but it's everything. It's the weight, it's the overall length, it's the width, it's the tapering, it's the grip length. It's got everything, guys. Somebody go make a replica of this thing. It'd be amazing. I'm fascinated by this find, honestly. I think it's amazing when anything gets found, archaeologically speaking, but I'm more amazed when it's this happenstance. And this is like the happenstance of happenstances. If someone had come across a sword and it was super degraded, we would all been like, yeah, they found a sword. But the fact they found one in such nice condition, it speaks a lot to how ridiculously unlikely that is, because everyone was thinking, there is no way this is real. There's a part of me that wants to say, man, this is like some sort of long con. But they did, you know, research on this. This is in the hands of historians and experts. They're looking at this and they're saying, yeah, this is accurate. This is, you know, as we would expect it to be. It's fascinating. I am just in love with this story. I'm in love. This is what I love about history, is that it's not predictable. You can't just say this is how history is going to work out. But instead, you get amazing stories like this. I hope to one day be able to go and see this in a museum and be like, I was alive when they found that thing. It's awesome. Anyway, that's it. That is this news story. It kind of completes it. You have a couple references here. Again, this is the kind of official posting on the Museum of Cultural History out of Norway. I think it's a fascinating read. I'll, again, link it in the description below. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this news story. Again, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, yada, yada, yada. The things you normally expect people to say at the end of the video like this, but more than anything, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're as excited about these finds as I am. And start sending me news stories, guys. People have already started doing it. Keep sending it. I'm really interested to do more videos like this. See you in the next one. Bye.